The crown rested in the great hall of the alien empire, a relic older than any living memory, forged in an age when their kind first rose from tribal clans into one united force. It was said that the first queen bound her life and spirit into it so that it would never rest on the head of the unworthy. The artifact was more than gold and jewels. It was a living will of judgment, glowing when greatness approached and fading when arrogance reached for it. For centuries that glow had been dim, waiting in silence while generations of heirs and successors came forward only to be rejected. The hall itself was a monument of stone and metal, built to outlast time. The walls carried carvings of battles, of fleets sailing across the stars, of treaties forged and enemies crushed. But beneath that glory was an emptiness that grew with each failed attempt to claim the throne. No ruler had worn the crown in hundreds of years, and though the empire still stood, it was fractured and restless. Noble houses argued, generals bickered, and the common people whispered that the empire was cursed without the touch of a true sovereign. Each cycle of succession brought new heirs forward. They trained in combat, in politics, in ancient rites, and each walked into the hall with heads high and voices full of confidence. Yet when their hands reached for the crown, the light would fade, cold and unyielding, until the hall fell into silence and the shameful retreat of another failure. Some fell to their knees and begged, some raged and screamed. Some tried to force the crown upon their heads only to find it heavier than stone, unmovable by any strength. The elders began to lose hope. If centuries had passed without a chosen one, perhaps the crown would never shine again, and so the empire began to rot from within. Without a single ruler to unite them, rival lords carved out their own territories. Armies that once fought under one banner turned against each other, defending borders that had never existed before. Trade routes broke apart, colonies at the edge of space cried out for aid and received none, and the people who once believed themselves destined for eternal rule over the stars began to wonder if their time was ending. In this slow collapse, there were still voices that spoke of destiny. They said the crown waited not for blood, but for spirit, not for inheritance, but for worth. These whispers were dismissed as fantasies, for it was easier to believe the crown had grown dormant than to accept the shame of its judgment. Yet the stories persisted, passed among slaves and servants, among the lowest of the empire, who clung to the hope that one day a ruler would rise and end the decay. Among these lowly ranks were the humans, a species conquered long ago. They were smaller, frailer in body compared to their alien masters, yet stubborn and difficult to break. Many served in mines, others in labor camps, and some as house servants in the homes of the nobility. They were seen as inferior, tolerated only for their usefulness, and kept under tight chains to prevent rebellion. But even among prisoners, stories spread, and humans learned of the crown that rejected every successor. To them it was not a tale of despair, but a spark of strange hope, a reminder that even the mightiest empire was not invincible. The nobles did not notice such thoughts. They were too consumed with their own rivalries, too concerned with proving themselves superior to their peers. Each new generation produced heirs who were more desperate than the last, pushing themselves to greater extremes, believing that through sheer force they could impress the ancient relic. Yet each attempt ended the same way. The hall remained dim, the crown silent, and the empire continued to unravel. At last, the crown became more of a curse than a blessing. Some nobles suggested locking it away, hiding it from the people, so that its silence would not shame them. Others argued it should be destroyed, though no weapon had ever scarred its surface. The elders, who remembered the wisdom of the past, insisted that it must remain where it was, for removing the crown would mean abandoning the last link to their origin and admitting that the empire's foundation had truly crumbled. And so it stayed, resting on its pedestal, cold and quiet, while the galaxy outside drifted further into disorder. The crown waited. That was the unspoken truth. Through centuries of silence it was not dead, only watching. Each rejected or left. Behind a faint memory in its glow, each failure strengthening the belief that the one it sought had not yet arrived. The Empire did not know this, for they could not feel the will within the crown. To them it was rejection, to the crown it was patience, and so the stage was set, though no one in the Empire could see it. Wars would rage, slaves would suffer. Nobles would fight their endless battles for scraps of power. Yet within the great hall, the crown continued its silent vigil, holding on to the choice it would one day make. It cared nothing for bloodlines or noble names, nothing for strength of armies or weight of gold. It waited for spirit, for courage, for the spark of a ruler who could bring balance, not through fear, but through a heart that endured chains and hardship, without breaking. Far from the marble and gold of the great hall, far from the noble courts and rival warlords, there lived a human prisoner in the dust and shadows of a labor camp. They were nameless to the Empire, faceless among thousands who toiled each day. Yet this prisoner carried something the crown had not seen in centuries, a fire that punishment could not extinguish, a will that chains could not crush. The Empire did not know it, the nobles did not expect it, but the silent crown was waiting for them, waiting for the moment when history would shift and the glow would return brighter than ever. The capital of the Empire was a city of towers that reached toward the sky like spears of stone and steel. Its streets stretched wide, filled with the banners of noble houses and the sounds of endless disputes. Merchants argued over trade, soldiers marched in armored lines, priests whispered prayers to gods long silent, yet beneath all this noise lay an emptiness no one could fill. The throne remained without a ruler, and the crown sat untouched, a reminder of failure that mocked every noble who passed beneath its glowless presence. In the heart of this city, within the walls of a fortress that served as both palace and prison, a human was brought forward in chains. The guards pushed them roughly, their laughter sharp as if the sight of a broken captive gave them joy. The prisoner's wrists were raw from the cuffs, their face marked by bruises, but their eyes were not dimmed. Even beaten, they carried a spark of defiance that unsettled those who looked too long. Humans were supposed to bow, to bend, to break, but this one did not. This one stood even in shackles, as if their spirit had not been touched by the weight of their bondage. The story of how the human came to the capital had already spread among the guards. In a distant labor camp, the prisoner had struck back against their overseers. A tool meant for mining had become a weapon in their hands, and though they were outnumbered and crushed swiftly, the act itself had left a mark. The Empire was built on the belief that humans were too weak to resist, too hopeless to rise, yet this one had risen. For that defiance, instead of execution, the nobles demanded the prisoner be brought before them as a curiosity. Some wanted to mock, others wanted to punish, and a few whispered of stranger things. The great hall of the crown was prepared. The nobles filled the seats along the edges, their robes flowing, their voices sharp with excitement. Another heir had failed only days before, another noble son who had walked forward proudly only to stumble back in shame when the crown turned cold. Desperation was thick in the air. The Empire needed hope, but hope had died long ago, and all that remained was spectacle. When the human was dragged into the hall, the nobles laughed. For what greater insult could there be than watching a slave stand where princes had fallen? The elders were not laughing. They were old and weary, their faces lined with years of waiting. They remembered words long forgotten by the young, words that said the crown would one day choose in a way none expected. When all had failed, when every bloodline had proven empty, the true heir would not be one of power or wealth, but of spirit. And so while the nobles mocked, one elder's voice rose above them all. If the crown had refused for centuries, then why not try the lowest of the low? If it rejected this prisoner too, then nothing would be lost. But if by some miracle it stirred, then perhaps the Empire would find its answer. The hall grew quiet as the human was forced forward. Shackled hands trembled, but not with fear. They trembled with rage at being paraded like an animal before the same nobles who had starved and beaten their kind for generations. The prisoner's eyes moved across the room and landed on the crown. It rested on a pedestal of black stone, its surface gleaming faintly, not with life but with the reflection of the hall's torches. For centuries it had been nothing but a silent ornament, yet in that moment it seemed to shift. A faint shimmer ran across its edges, so subtle that only the closest watchers noticed. The whispers began immediately. The guards shoved the prisoner to their knees before the crown. The laughter of the nobles rose again, sharp and cruel, as they called out their insults. They said the crown would crush the human spirit, that the relic would turn colder than ever before, that even touching it would burn the flesh of such an unworthy creature. But as the prisoner lifted their head, their gaze locked onto the relic with something none had shown before. It was not hunger for power, nor the desperation of inheritance, nor the arrogance of bloodline. It was curiosity, and behind that curiosity a stubborn defiance, a refusal to bow to anything, not even fate. The hall fell silent when the crown stirred. The shimmer grew stronger, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat, and the glow that had been absent for so long flickered for the first time in living memory. Gasps filled the air, nobles leaning forward in disbelief, elders gripping their staffs as if afraid the sight was illusion. The prisoner's shackled hands twitched. They did not move closer, not yet, for even they could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The silence was so heavy that every breath, every heartbeat seemed to echo through the chamber. The alien heirs shouted in outrage. They called it blasphemy, a trick, a mockery of their traditions. Some demanded the guards pull the prisoner away at once, claiming the glow was false, born of failing crystals and ancient magic fading into nothing. But the glow did not fade. It grew stronger with each passing second, warm and golden, spilling across the chamber until even the highest nobles could no longer deny it. The relic had slept for centuries, yet now it was awake. And it was awake for a human. The prisoner lifted their shackled hands slowly, almost against their own will, as if something deep within the crown called to them. The glow responded, pulsing brighter, filling the hall with light that had not been seen for ages. The nobles could not comprehend it. Generations of heirs had failed, yet this nameless human, dragged from chains and filth, had brought the crown to life with nothing more than their presence. The hall was divided between outrage and awe, between disbelief and a creeping fear that the stories might be true. The crown was choosing. The guards froze, uncertain if they should obey the shouts of the nobles or stand still in the face of such power. Even they could feel the air change, heavy with something ancient and undeniable. The prisoner, still kneeling, raised their eyes to the artifact. For a brief moment, their chains seemed forgotten, their bruises meaningless, for in that glow they saw not the weight of conquest, but the faint whisper of possibility. The crown was waiting for their touch, and the empire held its breath, caught between the end of an age and the birth of something new. The hall was silent, except for the low hum that filled the air as the crown pulsed with light. It was a sound, not made of metal or stone, but of something older, like the whisper of stars burning far above. The nobles who had mocked only moments before now leaned back in their seats, eyes wide with disbelief. The elders who had waited their entire lives for such a moment could hardly breathe. For centuries, the relic had remained cold and lifeless, but now it glowed brighter with each heartbeat of the human who knelt before it. Prisoner raised their heads slowly. Their chains clinked against the stone floor, a harsh reminder of their captivity, Yet in that light they seemed less like shackles and more like a symbol of the suffering they had endured. The crown called to them. Not with words, not with voices, but with a pull that reached deep into their spirit. It was as though it had been waiting, not for a noble heir with proud blood, but for someone who understood struggle, someone who had faced despair and yet remained unbroken. The nobles shouted in protest. They demanded the guards pull the human back, demanded that this insult be stopped before the relic was tainted forever. Yet none of the guards moved. Their eyes were fixed on the glow, and though they had no love for humans, they could feel the power in the chamber pressing against their skin. The relic was alive, and its will was greater than any command given by noble tongues. Even the strongest soldiers dared not interfere with something so ancient and so undeniable. The prisoner pushed themselves to their feet, slowly and unsteadily, but with a kind of strength that came not from muscles, but from determination. Their hands lifted, chains clattering as they reached forward. The crown's glow brightened until it lit the entire chamber, washing the walls in golden radiance that erased the shadows carved by torchlight. For the first time in centuries, the hall was alive with warmth, and the carvings of old battles and victories seemed to move as though history itself was remembering. Each step the prisoner took toward the pedestal was heavy, not because of the chains but because of the weight of countless eyes fixed on them. The alien heirs spat curses, their voices trembling with fear disguised as rage. They had trained their whole lives for the right to claim the relic, and yet none had been worthy. Now this nameless human, dragged in chains, dared to stand where they had failed. To them it was unbearable, yet they could do nothing to stop it. The glow of the crown made their anger meaningless. The prisoner's hand stretched closer, and the air grew thick, humming with unseen energy. The crown rose from its pedestal as if carried by invisible hands, floating just above the prisoners. Reach! Gasps spread through the chamber as the relic turned slowly, shimmering with light that flowed like liquid across its surface. It was not rejecting, nor was it waiting in silence. It was testing, measuring, watching. The prisoner froze, unsure. If they should continue, yet the pull within their spirit urged them forward. They lifted their chained hand and touched the air beneath the relic. A burst of light erupted. It was not blinding but pure, filling the chamber with warmth that pressed against every soul within it. The nobles shielded their eyes, the heirs stumbled back, and the guards dropped to their knees without even realizing it. Only the elders remained standing, tears streaming down their faces as they whispered words of ancient prophecy. The crown had awakened fully, and it had chosen. The prisoner felt the weight of it settle into their spirit, not crushing but steadying. As though it offered not just power but guidance, not just rule but responsibility, the relic lowered itself gently until it hovered just above the prisoner's head. The glow bathed their features, transforming the bruises into marks of resilience, the chains into symbols of defiance. The prisoner trembled, not from fear, but from the realization of what was happening. They had lived their life as a slave, nameless and powerless, yet here in the Hall of Empires, they were being offered a destiny greater than any noble's dream. The crown rested lightly on their brow, and in that instant the hum grew into a steady song that filled the chamber. With harmony, the nobles erupted in chaos. Some screamed that it was impossible. Others shouted that the relic had been tricked, that the human had poisoned it with strange magic. A few fell silent, unable to deny what their eyes had seen, unwilling but forced to accept that the crown itself had spoken with its light. The airs roared with fury, their pride shattered, their ambitions torn apart. Yet no matter how they protested, the crown's glow did not fade. Instead it burned brighter, a golden flame that filled the hall. Until even the loudest voice was drowned beneath its power, the prisoner stood taller now, no longer bowing under the weight of chains. Their eyes scanned the chamber, meeting the faces of nobles who had once believed themselves untouchable. They saw fear, anger, disbelief, and beneath it all a growing realization that their empire had changed forever. The crown had chosen, and it had chosen not one of them, but a human who had been nothing more than a prisoner. It was a moment that shattered the order of centuries, a moment that could not be undone. The elders stepped forward, their voices trembling as they declared the truth. The crown had never sought bloodlines or noble names. It had waited for a heart that carried both strength and compassion, for a spirit unbroken by suffering. The human was not chosen because of power or heritage, but because they embodied the very qualities that the empire had forgotten. Some nobles shouted that they would never bow to such a ruler, but their words were weak against the brilliance of the relic's light. The crown's will was beyond dispute. The prisoner felt the relic's thoughts like a whisper in their mind. Not words but emotions, guidance, fragments of ancient wisdom. They felt unity, hope, the memory of the first queen who had forged an empire from chaos. The message was clear. The crown had chosen them to restore what was lost, to bind together what centuries of greed had broken. They did not understand how they could bear such a burden, but they knew they could not turn away. For the first time in their life, they had something greater than survival. They had purpose. The hall remained silent as the glow finally settled, steady and unyielding. The prisoner, now crowned, stood in the center as the nobles struggled to accept what their eyes had seen. Outside the walls, the empire did not yet know that history had shifted. But within this chamber, every soul knew the truth. The crown had chosen, and nothing would ever be the same. The hall that had glowed with golden light slowly returned to shadow, yet the memory of what had happened lingered heavy in the air. The prisoner stood tall, though chains still bound their wrists. The crown rested on their head not like an ornament, but like a living flame that seemed to breathe with them. Every noble in the chamber had seen it descend of its own will. Every guard had felt the hum of its ancient power in their bones, and none could deny that it had chosen. Yet acceptance did not come easily. The heirs cried out in rage, their pride shattered like glass. The nobles shouted to the elders that this was blasphemy, that a human could never rule them, that the relic had been deceived by trickery. The elders raised their voices, but their age carried little strength against the storm of anger. They declared that the crown's choice was law, and that no tongue or sword could undo what had been witnessed. Some listened with fear in their eyes, others spat and swore vengeance. Already the chamber had turned into a battlefield of words, and only the glow of the crown kept the nobles from rushing forward in violence. The prisoner stood in silence, watching the fury unfold. They did not yet speak, for words felt too small to match the weight of what had happened. But inside their chest, a storm was rising, for they knew the world outside would not bow so easily. Days that followed spread the story across the empire like fire across dry fields. From the capital to the outer colonies, whispers turned into roars. The crown had chosen, and it had chosen a human. Among the highborn, the news was met with fury. Generals swore that they would never fight under the banner of a slave. Nobles gathered armies of their own, declaring that the empire would burn before they allowed such shame. Yet among the lowborn, among the servants, the miners, the soldiers who had bled in forgotten wars, and most of all among the enslaved, humans' hope began to bloom for the first time in living memory. The prisoner was freed from their chains, though not by the will of the nobles. The relic itself rejected the metal until the cuffs shattered as though they had never been forged. The glow around the crown burned away the marks of captivity, and for the first time the human stood unbound. The elders gave them chambers within the palace, though many whispered threats outside the door. Each night assassins tried to creep through shadowed halls, yet they never reached the human, for the relic shone when danger was near, casting light that burned away treachery. The crown did not only rest on their head, it shielded them, guided them, whispered to them in silence. the alien houses gathered in secret to plan their rebellion. Old rivalries were forgotten as fear of losing power brought them together. They declared the choice of the relic false and promised to crush this insult with steel and flame. Armies marched, banners rose, and the city trembled with unrest. Yet while nobles prepared for war, something unexpected was happening among the common folk. Humans once bowed and broken began to lift their heads. Alien workers long ignored began to gather. Even soldiers sent to enforce order found themselves hesitating when they saw the light of the crown shining in the streets. Slowly, uncertainly, people began to rally not to the nobles, but to the human. The prisoner did not seek to command, yet command came to them. They spoke not of conquest, but of unity, not of blood, but of worth. Their words were simple, carrying no practiced speeches, no grand promises, only truth born from years of suffering. They spoke of chains and hunger, of injustice and cruelty, and of the hope that the crown had given them. Those who listened found themselves stirred in ways no noble had ever achieved. For centuries they had been ruled by fear, but now for the first time they felt the pull of something greater than fear. They felt the pull of belief when the first clash came. It was not in the palace, but in the outer districts where noble armies tried to force the people back into silence. The soldiers advanced with blades raised, yet the crowds did not scatter. At their head stood the prisoner wearing the crown whose glow cut through the dust of battle. The nobles ordered their armies to strike, but many of the soldiers lowered their weapons, their loyalty breaking beneath the weight of the relic's light. Those who fought found themselves overwhelmed not by numbers, but by the sheer will of a people who had discovered hope. The uprising spread faster than any rebellion before it. Cities that had bent under noble rule for centuries now rose together. Colonies abandoned by the throne now sent their strength. The oppressed found courage in the sight of a human crowned in light, and the empire began to tilt on its axis. Yet the path was not without blood. Many nobles refused to surrender. They raised fleets and fortresses, they unleashed weapons long hidden, and the stars burned with war. Battles raged in orbit, and on soil whole districts turned to ash, yet the human did not falter. Guided by the whispers of the relic, they led not with force, but with strategy, striking where the nobles were weakest, sparing where they could, showing mercy where cruelty had been the norm. Each victory won new loyalty. Each act of compassion earned trust no noble had ever known. Slowly the tide shifted. What began as a rebellion became a movement. What began as a prisoner's defiance became the heart of a new empire. Still danger loomed for the greatest of the noble houses refused to bend. They gathered their fleets into one final force, vowing to crush the human before their crown could turn hope into permanence. The battle to come would decide not only who ruled, but whether the empire would survive. At all, the prisoner stood at the edge of the palace balcony, watching the stars beyond the city glow with the fires of distant war. The crown was heavy, yet not unbearable. They could feel the weight of lives pressing upon them, yet within that weight was strength. They knew the nobles would come with all they had, and they knew blood would spill, yet they also knew they could not turn back. For centuries the crown had waited for this moment, and now that it had come there was no returning to silence. The uprising was no longer a question of rebellion. It was the birth of something greater. The night before the final battle, the capital was quiet in a way it had not been for centuries. The streets that once echoed with the noise of noble commands and the steps of soldiers now carried the low murmur of people waiting together. Fires burned in corners where families sat not in fear but in expectation. The glow of the crown could be seen from the highest tower, reaching out across the city like a beacon in the dark sky. To many it was not only a relic now but a promise that the dawn would bring change. The prisoner, who had become more than a prisoner, stood at the balcony of the palace and looked at the stars. They had once dreamed only of freedom for themselves, but now freedom had grown into something larger. The crown pulsed softly upon their head, not as a burden, but as a companion guiding them in silence. In the glow they felt the weight of those who had come before, rulers who had united a broken people long ago, and they felt the trust of those who now waited behind them, the humans who had been enslaved, the aliens who had been forgotten, the soldiers who had turned their loyalty from lords to hope. For the first time the prisoner understood what it meant to be more than one life. They were a bearer of all lives. The great noble houses had gathered their fleets in orbit. Their ships filled the night sky with points of light like false stars. They were desperate and proud, unwilling to surrender centuries of privilege. They believed that by striking with all their strength at once, they could shatter the will of the people and silence the crown forever. Yet below the surface another army stirred. It was not made of polished legions or fleets of grand ships. It was built from miners and farmers, from servants and soldiers, from humans who had learned to fight in chains and aliens who had remembered their old oaths to unity. They had no single banner, but they had a single belief, and that belief was stronger than fear. When the first blast lit the sky, the city shook as though the heavens themselves had cracked. The noble fleets rained fire upon the capital, their weapons cutting the air with screams of energy. Yet the crown's glow did not falter. At the head of the people, the human raised their hand, and the relic blazed with light so bright that the flames in the sky dimmed against it. The defense of the people was not built on walls of steel, but on walls of will. Each strike that fell was met with resistance, not only of weapons, but of courage. The battle became more than war. It became a test of who could endure longer the chains of the past, or the hope of the future. On the ground the streets turned into rivers of movement as soldiers of the nobles clashed with crowds of rebels. Blades met tools, turned to weapons, shields met stones hurled by hands that had known labor more than battle. Yet with each cry the glow of the crown grew brighter. The human walked among them, not hiding behind walls, but standing at the front, where the fight was thickest. Every step they took gave strength to those beside them, and weakened the hearts of those who opposed them. Many soldiers of the nobles dropped their blades, unable to raise arms against the one chosen by the relic. Some even turned and fought against their former masters, their loyalty breaking at last. The battle raged through the day, into the night, and into the next dawn. The noble fleets began to falter as their supplies ran thin, and their soldiers deserted. One by one, the houses that had sworn never to bow were forced to kneel or face destruction. The greatest of the noble lords gathered for one final stand in the heart of the city, their armies holding the palace gates with desperate fury. The human entered with the crown blazing, and silence fell across the battlefield. The nobles spat curses, swearing that they would never accept a human on the throne. They charged in one last attempt to break destiny with blades of rage. But the people stood together, humans and aliens alike, forming a wall of unity no sword could pierce. In the end, the nobles fell not by the crown's fire, but by the weight of the very empire they had once ruled. When the battle ended, the city was scarred yet alive. Smoke curled from broken towers, but laughter rose in the streets where chains were being shattered. For the first time, humans walked freely beside aliens without fear. For the first time, servants were called brothers, and soldiers were called friends. The crown still glowed, though softer now, as if its task was fulfilled. It had chosen, and its choice had been proven in blood and fire. The empire that had rotted for centuries was now reborn, not through conquest, but through unity. Human who bore the crown did not take the throne in triumph, but in humility. They sat not above the people, but among them. They did not call themselves conqueror or emperor, but bearer chosen by the relic. They listened more than they commanded. They healed more than they punished. And in time the people began to call them ruler, not out of fear, but out of respect. The crown had not been wrong. It had sought not a noble name nor a mighty warrior, but a heart that could carry both strength and mercy. Through that heart the empire began to mend its broken pieces. Years passed and the memory of chains grew faint. Humans who had once been prisoners now became builders, leaders, teachers. Aliens who had once despised them now walked beside them. The stars that had burned with war now shone with fleets carrying trade and peace. The relic still rested on the head of the bearer, glowing softly as though it was content at last. And though the prisoner who had become ruler knew that hardship would never vanish entirely, they also knew that the empire would never return to the decay it had once suffered. For it had been reborn not upon bloodlines, but upon choice. The story of the crown was told across worlds, not as a tale of shame, but as a lesson that greatness could rise from anywhere. Children grew up hearing that once the relic had waited for centuries, ignoring kings and generals until it found a human in chains who refused to bow. They learned that power without compassion is nothing, that heritage without courage is empty, and that even the lowest of the low can rise higher than the proudest throne if their spirit endures. The empire lived by that story, and in that story it found its strength. And so the crown that had refused every successor for centuries burned brightest for the one no one expected. It had chosen a human who had nothing and gave them everything, and through that choice it gave back to an entire people what they had forgotten. Not conquest, not pride, not fear, but hope. The prisoner was no longer prisoner, the slave was no longer slave, the nameless was no longer nameless. They were the bearer of the crown, the human who had carried the empire into light. And in their rule, the galaxy learned that sometimes the greatest of rulers rise not from thrones, but from chains. The end.